are such a genuine gem. Thank you for clicking on my video. I'm Brooke McKenna, but today's case is about the pastor and the choir singer, the Hall Mills case. Now, this is an unsolved case with many secrets in a town that knew much more than they wanted to get involved in. By the way, I post so much content like this. I did all of October, which was so much just super strange content, and there will be a playlist down below if you've missed any of those. But make sure to subscribe if you do enjoy these type of videos, because I post a ton. And if you want to make a girl happy, all you have to do is give this a thumbs up and maybe leave a nice comment down below. Now let's get back to the story. So it was 1922 in New Jersey, and a tragedy would occur that September. It was September 16th when a teenage couple was walking through a field in New Brunswick when they would come across two bodies. And this was a field near a farm that wasn't really around anything too crazy. It was right next to a crab apple tree, but there wasn't a ton of people around. And they would find the bodies of a man and a woman, and they would immediately go to the nearest house to call the police. And when the police got there, they noticed that these bodies almost looked as though they were positioned with their feet pointed at this crabapple tree. The man's hand was positioned on the woman's neck, and the woman's hand was positioned on his knee. He was wearing this Panama hat that was kind of covering his face so you couldn't see his face, and the woman actually had a brown silk scarf on. Now, immediately the man's body was identified because his card, his business card, was propped up against his foot. And he was 41-year-old Reverend Edward Wheeler Hall, and he had been shot once in the head with a .32 caliber pistol. He also had a slight bruise on the top of his ear, and he had abrasions on his left little finger and his right index finger. He also had a wound below his kneecap and his calf. Now, he was wearing glasses, and he also still had coins in his pocket, but his watch was missing. Now, the woman's death had been a bit more gruesome. She had actually been shot 3 times in the head with this .32 caliber pistol, and that wasn't all. A police officer that was inspecting the scene noticed that there were maggots in her neck. And upon a closer inspection, they found that her throat had been cut from ear to ear. They also found torn up pieces of paper scattered around these two bodies, and when they started to piece them together, they realized that they were torn up love letters. Now, when the bodies went in for an autopsy to hopefully identify this woman and kind of see more about her wound, possible murder weapon, they found that it wasn't just that her throat had been cut. She was actually missing her larynx and her tongue. They had both been cut out. She had been wearing a blue dress with red polka dots, black silk stockings, and brown shoes with a blue velvet hat that was kind of laying next to her body. She also had a bruise on her arm and a tiny cut on her lip, but other than that, there were no other wounds. But she was finally identified as 34-year-old Eleanor Reinhardt Mills. And Eleanor actually sang in the choir that the reverend that was deceased next to her worked at. And Eleanor's husband, Jimmy Mills, actually worked at this church as well as the janitor. Well, remember the torn up love letters around the bodies, even though both of these deceased individuals were married? Well, they were pieced back together, and one of them was from Eleanor to the pastor, and it said, "Sweetheart, my true heart, I know there are girls with more shapely bodies, but I'm not caring what they have. I have the greatest part of all blessings, a noble man's deep, true, eternal love. How impatient I am and will be. I want to look up into your dear face for hours as you touch my body close. And there was also a letter from Edward, the pastor, to Eleanor saying, "Darling Wonderheart, I just want to crush you for 2 hours. I want to see you Friday night alone by our road where we can let out unrestrained that universe of joy and happiness we call ours." Now, Edward actually signed his letters with DTL, which stands for a phrase in German which means thy true lover. Now, Eleanor would sign hers Babykin. So they obviously had a very deep and meaningful to them relationship. It was just too bad that they were both already in one. Now, this possible affair, when it came out to the public, wasn't much of a surprise. Many people in the area actually knew because they all went to this church and they could just tell, and it wasn't really a huge deal to everybody or to anyone really. However, these murders were, and everyone kind of wanted to be involved from the very beginning, which was a bad thing because the police weren't necessarily on top of their game as far as keeping this crime scene intact. And the problem was, it was kind of on the border of Middlesex and Somerset County, and so of course the two police departments were trying to figure out whose jurisdiction it really was, and so they were more worried about that than everyone in the community really wanting in on this crime scene and doing whatever it took to get inside and to touch things and to mess up evidence. Crime scene tape had not yet been put up. Nobody was protecting the area, so this community trampled in wanting to get little souvenirs and pieces from this crime scene, which I just think is super weird. But knowing that people did this back in the day just freaks me out. I've researched so many vintage cases and they will literally talk about people wanting to take pieces of a murder scene. People were going in and they were trying to take the bark off the crabapple tree that they were next to, and when that wasn't working anymore, they tried to actually pull up the tree from its roots. They also found the business card that was propped up on Edward's foot, and they began to pass it around to look at it, which meant that all of their fingerprints were on it, and it would make it even harder to figure out who placed it there. Once everything was figured out between the police departments, the most that it could be, they really did come up with what they believed was the motive, and that was jealousy, that this was a broken marriage that led to murder. But now they just needed to figure out which side it came from. Was it Edward's wife or Eleanor's husband? Now that's when a witness would come forward, and her name was Jane Gibson. She lived near this area. She owned a farm. She was a hog farmer actually, and she had said that the night of the murders around 9 p.m. she had heard a noise and then her dog started barking, and that's when she looked outside and saw a figure in her cornfield, and it appeared to be a man. And so of course she wanted to protect her field and her land, and she thought that this person was possibly a thief, so she rode out on her mule to stop them. And when she got closer, she noticed that there was a car that was parked, and so she just kind of stopped there and listened, and that is when she heard people talking. She then noticed that there were 2 women and 2 men near this tree, and screams began to erupt. A woman was screaming to explain these letters, and then a gunshot actually went off, and Jane saw a figure actually fall to the ground. Then the same woman screamed, "Don't," 3 more times, and then the last thing Jane heard was the woman scream out, "Henry," as the second body dropped. And at this point she rode away, not wanting to be a part of it. And after she came forward, Jane actually became the face of this investigation because it was the only witness that knew anything, and people in the public began to call her Pig Woman in all of the newspapers because she did own a hog farm. Unfortunately, even with this witness statement, nothing was ever done as far as this case. It seemed like it would be an open and closed investigation. They knew what the motive was. They knew about the torn up love letters. I mean, it just all kind of fell into place. However, nothing ever came of it. Nobody was arrested. Nobody went to trial. And it's speculated that that was because Edward Hall's wife, Frances, was from one of the wealthiest families in the area at the time. And we all know what kind of things money can get you out of. Many began to suspect Frances in the murders and that she possibly got away with it. And they even speculated that she had worked with her brothers Henry and William Stevens, as well as her cousin Henry Carpenter. They both had the name Henry, which would make sense as to why this pig woman heard somebody scream out Henry. And Frances then did an interview with a reporter, and she said that she had nothing to do with the murders at all. And it would be 4 years until anything else would be done in this case, because this is when it was said that the truth finally came out. You see, the maid of Edward and Frances Hall was named Louise, and Louise was going to marry a man named Arthur. Now, Louise had told her future husband that when she was working for the Halls, that she had found out about Eleanor and Edward's affair, and that Frances did as well. And of course, she wasn't very happy about this, but Edward wanted to basically get away from Frances and elope with Eleanor. But instead of letting him do that, Frances went out with her brothers and cousin and did what needed to be done. And she also gave her maid Louise $5,000 to keep quiet about it all. Now, when Arthur heard about this, he actually didn't want to marry Louise anymore, and he went to the police immediately with this information and told them what he knew. And thankfully, because of this, the New York Daily Mirror ran this story, which caught the attention of the New Jersey governor, who ordered a second investigation to begin. And this would lead to a trial happening on November 3rd of 1926, and Frances and her brothers and her cousin were all being tried for the murder of Edward and Eleanor. Her cousin, however, won a bid to be tried separately, but they were all held at the Somerset County Courthouse, and it was huge news because of the Hall family being so wealthy and well known, and so people really wanted to hear what was going to happen. The main witness was still the pig woman, Jane Gibson. However, this was 4 years later, and Jane now had cancer and was actually on her deathbed, so they had to wheel her in on her deathbed to give her statement. However, her statement continued to change over the years. It wasn't exactly the same. I mean, this could have been because it had been years since it actually happened, or it could be like the defense was saying that Jane was just crazy and uneducated, but it also didn't help that her own mother was sitting in the courtroom screaming, "She's a liar, she's a liar, she's a liar," the entire time she was talking. The trial lasted 30 days, and by the end of it, there just wasn't enough evidence to convict the four of murder, especially because so much evidence had been contaminated from the crime scene originally. And Frances's brother, Henry, actually had 3 witness statements that corroborated his story that he was miles away fishing at the time of the murders. However, her other brother, William, did have a .32 caliber pistol like the one used on Edward and Eleanor, and the only thing was it had been kind of shaved down or filed down so it couldn't be fired, so he couldn't harm himself. It was thought that he had some mental disabilities, so that's why they did so, to keep him from harming himself, because he wanted this gun. But either way, they were all found not guilty. Frances Hall's reputation was completely shattered after this, and she actually filed a defamation suit against the newspaper for everything they said about her. Now, I'm not sure why Eleanor's husband was never looked into. I mean, I couldn't find anything that said whether he was ruled out in this case. It just kind of glossed over him, and I don't see why he couldn't have been one of the men that the pig woman Jane saw that night at the crabapple tree. I mean, I think Frances and Jimmy could have worked together on this. I don't see why they wouldn't have, unless it was a very spur of the moment decision on Frances's part. When she found out, she immediately went after them. But I think that it probably happens a lot that when people find their partners cheating, they kind of team up, and I don't think that that should have been ruled out. Now, there is a theory that the pig woman herself actually murdered them because they were on her property or whatever, but she blamed it on Frances when people started speculating that because it was an easy out for her, and so that's when she came up with this witness statement that just made her even more guilty looking. I think that it's quite strange that her own mother was calling her daughter a liar. I mean, maybe her mom knew what Jane was capable of, or that she was evil in general, or maybe she knew what she had done. Maybe Jane had told her and told her to keep quiet about it, and then her mother just couldn't after all those years. And I do see why everybody wants to point a finger at Frances, because, of course, it was her husband having an affair with a younger woman, and everybody in the town knew about it. I'm sure it was very devastating for her, very embarrassing, but did she actually know about it? Who knows? I'd love to hear your theories on this one. Thought it was super interesting, wanted to tell you guys about it, and I'm just so happy that you are here and listening, and it does mean the world to me. So don't ever forget to speak up. Your voice is powerful enough, and I love you to absolute pieces. Okay, bye.